As many of you know, I grew up in the Mountain West state of South Dakota, and like I guess any other place, South Dakota has its own flavor. And among its treasures is what is billed as the world's only corn palace. Now, I travel a fair amount, and I have to admit that elsewhere in the nation or in the world, it's a little bit difficult to explain a corn palace. But it's a real thing, a last survivor of an interesting part of American history, and it deserves to be remembered. The origin of the idea of a corn palace is rather surprising. The 1735 to 1739 Russo-Turkish War. The entire context of the complex conflict is beyond the scope of this episode, but roughly it was a war in which the Russian Empire of Empress Anna Ivanovna sought to take territory to give them access to the Black Sea from the Ottoman Empire. It was, in fact, a conflict fought over what is today Ukraine, and mostly wound up being a defeat for Austria. But Russia, while not achieving its most ambitious goals, did end up in the 1739 Treaty of Niš with access to a Black Sea trading port. And so Empress Anna decided to celebrate by making a palace out of ice. The idea of an ice palace is simple. Blocks of ice are cut and built into a castle. The first ice palace was a substantial structure, 80 feet long and 30 feet high, and built along the river Neva, and accompanied by a festival so bizarre that it epitomized why Empress Anna had come to earn the moniker, the Mad Tsarina. But the idea of making a palace out of ice was saved both by contemporary descriptions and then by an 1835 novella by Russian author Ivan Ivanovich Levichnikov, published in 1835. And that idea was taken up by the citizens of Montreal, Canada. Montreal is an old city, founded in 1642, but not incorporated in its modern form until 1832. It was originally the capital of the province of Canada until an angry mob burned down the Parliament buildings in 1849, and the capital was moved eventually to Ottawa. In 1883, an enterprising city lawyer and member of the Montreal Snowshoe Club had the idea of attracting business to the city by making it a center for winter sport. And to that end, the city held its first winter carnival in 1883. Along the banks of the St. Lawrence River. As part of the carnival, which the Montreal Gazette called a success far beyond the anticipation of the most sanguine, was an ice palace, not just an homage to Empress Anna, but also a location for a ball. Like Anna's palace, the first Montreal ice palace was built along the banks of the river and became a way to advertise the unique charm of a Canadian winter. It was an idea so good that it crossed the border. The Montreal Ice Palace was enough of a success in drawing people to the city that 2 years later, the city of St. Paul, Minnesota had a similar idea. The St. Paul Globe wrote of the plan in November 1885. If consummated, it would not only keep in St. Paul many of those who are now accustomed to take a yearly hijra to the south, but would also attract multitudes from the outside whose appreciation of the delights of a northern winter would be keen at the first attempt, but also who find themselves so much delighted and invigorated by the sport as to be attracted to it for succeeding winters, and to make Minneapolis-St. Paul as famous as a healthful winter resort as it is now a place to spend the summer. Now, you might think that an ice palace on the other side of the world, St. Paul is more than 4,500 miles from St. Petersburg, would be the greatest extent of the influence of Empress Anna, who died in 1740, just a year after her ice palace was built. But her idea was about to take another great leap. The Pierre, South Dakota Free Press wrote in 1887, having gazed at the St. Paul Ice Palace and hearing its praises sung throughout the land, the good people of Sioux City proposed to have a palace of their own in which to be enthroned and worshipped the great King of the West, King Corn. The Sioux City Journal wrote, St. Paul and Montreal have their ice palaces, which melt at the first approach of spring, but Sioux City is going to build a palace of the product of the soil that is making it a great pork-packing center of the Northwest. Why Sioux City and why 1887? The Palimpsest, a historical magazine published by the State Historical Society of Iowa, wrote in October 1922, while nearly the entire country suffered from drought in the summer of 1887, propitious showers saved the crops in the middle portion of the Missouri Valley. The corn fields of northwest Iowa yielded amazingly, and the concomitant hogs grew fat. In the midst of this fortunate region lay Sioux City, the prodigy of the West. Grateful for this extraordinary prosperity and in recognition of the decisive importance of the agricultural interests of the surrounding territory, Several of the prominent businessmen of Sioux City met on the evening of August 20th to devise a means of public expression of thanksgiving for the bounteous crops of the Northwest and the remarkable growth of the city. Various plans were considered. One man suggested a jubilee with heaps of corn along the streets as continual reminders of the cause of the festival. Another proposed to decorate the courthouse with corn stalks and make it a center for public speaking, music, and entertainment. Then came a brilliant idea. Why not build a palace of corn? Corn, or maize, was developed in America before Europeans arrived. North Dakota State University explains that when Europeans like Columbus made contact with people living in North and South America, corn was a major part of the diet of most native people. Corn is a versatile grain that can grow in numerous types of climate and soil and can be made further adaptable via hybridization. And corn really came into its own in the 19th century. Agricultural columnist Karen Braun explained in 2020 that improvements in transportation networks and mechanical farm equipment decreased cost and helped to grow the United States into a major exporter of grains. She writes, "The Chicago Board of Trade listed the world's first exchange-traded future contracts in 1864, and together with the advances in communication, production, transportation, and quality standardization, the United States became the largest force in the global corn market by the 1870s. By 1898, U.S. corn exports reached 200 million bushels, and by 1900, agriculture accounted for about 62% of U.S. exports. And Iowa had reason to brag about its corn, not only for the success it had brought, but for the potential for what it could bring," the Sioux City Journal wrote in 1887. The Corn Palace is intended to call the attention of the world more generally to this cereal. The effect thus far has been very satisfactory. Not only have the people of Sioux City become deeply interested in corn, but nearly every farmer for hundreds of miles is talking corn. It simply gives new life to this industry. That corn raising will be encouraged by the coming Jubilee is not even questioned. The first Sioux City Corn Palace exposition opened October 3rd, 1887. The website Farm Progress writes, "Winnebago Native Americans sold the city corn to decorate the palace. More than 130,000 people visited the Corn Palace the first week it was open, including U.S. President Grover Cleveland and his wife. He called it something new under the sun." The Sioux City Public Museum explains that the whole Corn Palace idea started snowballing. The people were indeed a little corn crazy. They decorated the streets with all the pizzazz they could muster. They built great arches at the major intersections in town, some measuring 50 feet high. And each of these arches was lit with gas lights covered with different colored glass globes. The palimpsest writes, "There was corn everywhere, and in the midst of the festive display stood the Corn Palace, the pride of Sioux City and the marvel of all who beheld it. Above each doorway was a panel on which agricultural scenes were portrayed in bas-relief, while upon a platform at the top of each entrance tower was depicted an allegorical scene in figures. And this art was done primarily in corn." The palimpsest writes, "Everyone was experimenting with grain as a medium of artistic expression. Corn seemed to be particularly well adapted to such a use. Ears of every color, sawed lengthwise into halves and transversely into sections, were nailed to the walls in intricate patterns and geometrical figures." The carnival and palace were such a success that a palace was again built in 1888. Covering the entire outer surface of the palace required an estimated 30,000 bushels of corn, all that a section of land in northwest Iowa would normally produce. In 1889, the carnival included, quote, "hundreds of Indians from the reservations in their primitive garb. They were very conspicuous in the old settlers' parade, imparting the color of bygone days to the pageant of progress." And a new invention. Phonograph records were made and reproduced at the Corn Palace, to the anguish of the musicians. And King Corn was anthropomorphized. 3 times during the festival, which lasted from September 25th to October 11th, King Corn came forth in the costume of a knight of old, followed by a retinue of glittering attendants. Janice Cerny, the official historian of the Mitchell Corn Palace, wrote in 2004 that in 1889, Sioux City advertised its Corn Palace with the Corn Palace Train, decorated like the palaces. A band on board helped to attract attention as it traveled the eastern seaboard. Similar success was found in 1890, and in 1891 the largest Corn Palace of all was built. But the festival was struck by cold weather. Made so little money that the sponsors didn't make enough money to tear the place down. The Sioux City Public Museum writes that it was sold at auction for $1,200 to one H. Buckwalter, who salvaged the wood and nails and sold the corn as feed. The museum writes, the discovery that sheep would eat the corn and carefully avoiding the nails, they found a market for the corn. Despite the losses in 1891, there were plans to build a palace in 1892. But in May, the Floyd River flooded, killing 10 people and destroying much of the town. With all these financial losses, officials didn't feel they had enough money to build a palace that year, the museum writes. There were plans for 1893, but the great financial panic that year ended those plans. The magnificent palaces of corn in Sioux City never returned. But that doesn't mean that the idea was gone. In fact, it had spread. The website Farm Progress explains. From the 1880s to 1930, at least 34 corn palaces were built in 24 towns across the Midwest. And there weren't just palaces made of corn. The website Roadside America writes, there was a sugar beet palace in Grand Island, Nebraska, a sorghum palace in Arcola, Illinois, and dozens more. And among all those palaces was one in Mitchell, South Dakota. Cerny writes, the Mitchell Corn Belt Real Estate Association worked diligently to lure settlers and entrepreneurs to the region. The association watched with interest when the neighboring towns of Plankinton and Sioux City, Iowa held harvest festivals, housed in grand palace structures decorated in mosaic patterns of corn, grasses, and grain from the agricultural region. South Dakota was still the frontier, but the association figured that good soil for growing king corn would attract farmers and sell land. Cerny writes, representatives of the Corn Belt Real Estate Association traveled to Sioux City to study their plans of the agricultural extravaganza. They liked what they saw and hired Andrew Kings to design a grain-decorated hall for Mitchell to house a harvest festival to be held in the fall to display agricultural products and promote settlement. What resulted was a 60 by 100-foot palace, resplendent with magnificent towers and turrets, a shrine to the rural way of life that dominated the scene during the first half of the 20th century. The first Mitchell Corn Palace opened its doors on September 28, 1892, just 13 years after Mitchell was platted. Like Sioux City, Mitchell had hard times. Cerny notes that the Panic of 1893 and drought halted the exposition for several years until it was revived in 1900. Gradually, the Corn Palace fad faded, but not in Mitchell. Cerny continues. It wasn't until 1902 that the town made an annual commitment to hold the event. The exposition was renamed the Corn Palace Festival in 1905. And in that same year, the original structure was torn down and replaced with a 125-foot by 142-foot structure of Moorish design. In 1905, the palace was the centerpiece of an unsuccessful bid to steal the state capitol from Pierre. Cerny explains that for over 100 years, a magnificent history of entertainment has unfolded at the Corn Palace, from the days of vaudeville, variety and novelty acts, the big band era, television personalities, to pop and country music. And the tradition continues. Today, two sports teams, the Dakota Wesleyan Tigers and the Mitchell High Colonels, play home basketball games in the Corn Palace, which USA Today named one of the top 10 places in America for high school basketball. Roadside America writes that visitors to the Corn Palace can pose with a grinning ear of corn named Cornelius, browse the gift shop and sells corn cob jelly, and stand on an outdoor balcony to be seen on the Corn Cam, waving to folks back home. The indoor space, an auditorium that's hosted everyone from Andy Griffith to the Three Stooges, has its own set of corn murals, some with designs that date back decades. Travel South Dakota writes that the inside of the Corn Palace is also home to graduation ceremonies, theater productions, banquets, and even the local prom. Certainly there have been obstacles. A drought in 2007 meant a shortage of corn and the decorations couldn't be replaced, so the 2006 decorations had to stay up for 2 years. The corn for the decorations is grown by a single farmer in 12 naturally grown colors, using no dyes: black, blue, white, variegated orange, calico, yellow, green, light and dark brown, and light, medium, and dark red. And yes, the palace website writes, birds do eat the corn. The palace is sometimes referred to as the world's largest bird feeder. Cerny writes, the Corn Palace has played a significant role in the economic, cultural, social, political, and historical life of the state. Each Corn Palace has kept the pulse of the times, weathering the political and economic storms, as well as enjoying prosperity. It has endured as a lasting tribute to South Dakota. So yes, it is a strange path from the Russo-Turkish War to the world's largest bird feeder, but the world's only corn palace is still, according to its website, Mitchell, South Dakota's #1 tourist attraction. attracting nearly 500,000 visitors a year, and take it from a local South Dakotan, it is well worth a pilgrimage someday. Roadside America says that it is a regal example of American folk art and the lone 21st century survivor of a 19th century fad to decorate buildings with everything from alfalfa to oats. And, you know, it's better than anything they got up in North Dakota. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.